You are standing on a factory floor in the Ural Mountains, and somewhere in front of you sits the tank that was supposed to make every other tank in the world obsolete. It has no one in its turret. For the first time in the history of armored warfare, the crew is not sitting behind the gun. They are sealed away in a reinforced capsule at the front of the hull, watching the battlefield through cameras and sensors while the cannon above them fires itself. This is not science fiction. This is the T-14 Armata, Russia's answer to 70 years of tanks built the same way, and on paper, it changes the entire equation of survival on the battlefield. So why has it barely fought? Let's start with what makes this machine different. Every tank since the Second World War has asked its crew to sit right next to the ammunition. A shell that could not fully penetrate the armor could still cook off the round stored beside the gunner, and the crew paid for that design compromise with their lives. The T-14 breaks that compromise completely. Its turret is unmanned. The gun, a 125mm smoothbore cannon designated the 2A82-1M, is aimed, loaded, and fired entirely by remote control, fed by an automatic loader the crew never has to touch. The three-man crew sits forward of all of it, in an armored capsule isolated from the turret and the ammunition carousel. If the worst happens and a round finds its way in, the theory is simple: the explosion vents upward and outward, away from the humans, instead of through them. Layered onto that capsule is the Malachite reactive armor system, designed to trigger outward and disrupt an incoming warhead before it ever reaches the hull. And above all of it sits Afghanet, an active protection system built to detect an incoming round with radar and destroy it in the air, before it ever completes its flight toward the tank. Decode that term for a moment: active protection isn't passive armor absorbing a hit. It's a defensive weapon in its own right, engaging the threat before the threat engages you. Compare that to the gun itself. The 2A82-1M fires a round called Vacuum 1, an armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot shell with a penetrator roughly 900mm long. British military intelligence flagged the Armata as early as 2016 as a serious concern for Western armies, precisely because of this combination: a crew that might survive a direct hit, paired with a gun capable of defeating the frontal armor of nearly anything else on the battlefield. In response, Germany's Rheinmetall developed a new, larger 130mm tank gun specifically to try to close that gap. That alone tells you how seriously this design was taken the moment it appeared. You do not redesign your own main gun because of a tank that doesn't matter. Picture the moment this system is tested. A missile is inbound. The radar panel on the turret picks it up in a fraction of a second. The system calculates an intercept point, and a countermeasure fires outward to meet it before it ever reaches the crew capsule. The three men inside never see the impact. They feel a jolt, maybe hear the bang. They keep working. That is the entire premise the Armata was built on: a tank that can absorb the modern anti-tank battlefield and keep its crew alive to fight through it. It is built by Uralvagonzavod, the same manufacturer responsible for most Soviet and Russian tanks since the Second World War, and when it rolled through Red Square for the first time in 2015, Russian officials were talking about a fleet numbering in the thousands. Here is the twist. 10 years later, that fleet does not exist. Ukrainian military intelligence has put Russia's total T-14 count at roughly 20 vehicles, and every one of them comes from the original prototype batch. Not 20 per year. 20, total. In 2023, Russian manufacturers were assigned a production target of 29 additional tanks. They built 0. And in March of 2024, Rostec's own chief executive, Sergei Kemezov, said publicly what outside analysts had suspected for years: the T-14 has never been deployed to fight in Ukraine, because it is simply too expensive to risk there. The T-90, he said, is the more efficient option. Sit with that for a second. The tank engineered to be the most survivable armored vehicle on Earth has spent Russia's largest land war since 1945 sitting in reserve, while older, cheaper machines do the fighting. Why? Because the numbers do not work. A T-14 costs somewhere between $5 and $9 million to build. Upgrading an existing T-72 to the modern T-72B3M standard costs under $250,000. When a war is burning through hundreds of tanks a year, a military does not send its most expensive, hardest to replace asset into that fire. It sends the cheap ones, the ones it can afford to lose and rebuild. Eurovagonzavod has quietly shifted almost entirely toward refurbishing T-72s and T-80s and mass-producing the T-90M instead, tanks with none of the T-14's unmanned turret or crew capsule, because those tanks can actually be replaced when they are destroyed. There have been claims otherwise. Russian state media reported in 2023 that T-14s were used for indirect fire support near the front, and that some were pulled back after a brief evaluation period. But Ukrainian intelligence has said it has no confirmation that a T-14 has ever fired a shot in actual combat. What is confirmed is this: the tank was absent from Moscow's Victory Day parade in 2023, the same year its manufacturer was supposed to be delivering nearly 30 new units. A tank designed to headline Russia's military showcase was too valuable, or too incomplete, to even put on display. Go back to Eurovagonzavod's own history for a moment, because it explains why this kept happening. The company had already absorbed a 10 billion ruble loss back in 2015, the same year the Armata was unveiled to the world, and it went through repeated management shakeups in the years that followed. A next-generation platform requires new tooling, new assembly lines, and new supply chains for components like the capsule's composite armor, all of which take years and enormous capital to stand up properly. War does not create that capital. It consumes it. Every ruble spent standing up a new T-14 production line is a ruble not spent refurbishing the thousands of T-72s and T-80s already sitting in storage yards, tanks that can be back on a train to the front in weeks instead of years. So picture the counterintuitive moment at the center of this whole story. A tank exists that can theoretically absorb an anti-tank missile and let its crew walk away. And the country that built it will not risk it in the one war where that capability would matter most. What does that mean for everyone watching from outside Russia? For NATO planners, the T-14 has functioned less as a battlefield threat and more as a signal of what a future adversary might eventually field at scale, once the production problems are solved. Germany and France have already begun work on a joint next-generation tank program, a project meant to eventually replace both the Leopard 2 and the Leclerc, partly in direct response to the Armata's unmanned turret concept, even though the vehicle that inspired it has barely left the factory floor. That is the strange power this tank has had all along. It has shaped billions of dollars in Western tank development decisions almost entirely through the threat of what it might become, rather than anything it has actually done. For Russia's export ambitions, the story is similarly complicated. Countries like India and China have expressed interest in the platform over the years, and Russia has floated proposals for technology transfer and local production abroad. But China's own Norinco has aggressively marketed its VT-4 as a cheaper, more reliably manufactured alternative, and a tank Russia won't even trust in its own war is a difficult sell to a foreign buyer who wants proof it works, not a demonstration model with a production run of 20. There is a broader lesson buried in this story, and it has nothing to do with armor thickness or muzzle velocity. It is about what happens when engineering ambition collides with industrial reality. The T-14 is not a failure of design. Every documented feature of it, the isolated crew capsule, the unmanned turret, the active protection system, represents a genuine step forward in tank survivability, one that Western militaries have taken seriously enough to redesign their own future vehicles around it. But a tank that cannot be built in numbers, and cannot be risked in the field, is a demonstration, not a weapon. Russia proved it could design the tank of the future. What it could not do was afford to actually fight a war with it. And that is the real story behind the machine that was supposed to make every other tank obsolete. It sits in reserve in the Ural Mountains, in a batch of 20, while cheaper, older tanks do the dying in its place. The crew capsule remains empty of combat scars. The turret has never had to prove, under real fire, whether it can do what it was built to do. You are standing on a factory floor in the Ural Mountains, and somewhere in front of you sits the tank that was supposed to make every other tank in the world obsolete. It still is that tank, on paper. It just never got the chance to prove it.